Well, welcome to class today. I'm recording this on the Wednesday before Holy Week, the Wednesday of Holy Week, and with the expectation that you'd be able to watch it by Monday morning. The book that we're talking about is Michael Myers and Carla Fine's book, Touched by Suicide, which is a powerful book which kind of reframes the entire aspect of suicide survivorship as a kind of grief endurance experience. So it's a grace-filled book, I found, and there's a directness to the conversation. The way that the authors talk directly to you about their experiences with suicide that really offer a sense of hope, I think. I was thinking that it was profound to be talking about this topic on Holy Week when we have a suicide in the Christian tradition, the death of Judas, but there's no real celebration for that or way of memorializing that. And indeed, Judas seems to be not grieved very well by the first Christians. They just move right on and they go into planning mode and getting the next person to do his job. But we might wonder how the death of Judas created a kind of residual grief for the Christian community. And if a book like Touched by Suicide might be able to help us with that. Fine and Meyer suggest that there's a way to find supportive others who've been through the journey and receive help. But it's a long grief journey with a complex trajectory. Acceptance and meaning-making, traditional goals of grief therapy, are much less the goal for suicide care. There's a much more limited goal in this instance. Those who face the suicide of a loved one are terrified, dazed, heartbroken, and need support groups quickly to help them normalize their experience and not blame themselves. It's through support groups that they come to see that they're not at fault for what's happened, even as they see other survivors learning not to blame themselves. Really, suicide recreates one's life, and grief requires learning to accept the changes to the self that come as a result. They suggest that memory loss, mood disturbance, and mood swings are all a normal part of the grief. Interestingly, this book treats continuing bonds as a form of sensory disturbances when you experience the presence of a loved one. This book sees those as experiences as symptoms. People who face the loss of someone by suicide are much more angry than we allow them to be, and they deny the suicide at times, blaming it on other factors. If the story of the suicide is tinged with shame, it becomes a big secret, and people will blame it on other factors. But if the story, for 6 months after such a loss, every kind of response would be normal. But for folks who continue to have intrusive thoughts or self-blaming thoughts that they can't manage on their own after 6 months, they're going to need therapeutic assistance. The authors say it's normal to have what they call psych ache after such a loss, to want to flee the world. The first year of suicide after a suicide is a blur. The second is when grief starts to hit. The fifth year is a major marker of survivorship, and it takes a long time to move on and join new relationships without guilt, and even longer to accept the suicide as someone's decision. The search for meaning, as we've said, is elusive after suicide. Although mental illness plays a role in many suicides, so does impulsive action, and the presence of firearms and alcohol are significant contributing factors. Suicide notes are a dismal form of communication, often obscuring as much as they seek to reveal. Some people experience the rage of another in suicide, thinking that other person's anger was purposefully directed at them through the act. Gaining insight rather than forgiving the other is the goal of the therapeutic work. what's more essential really in suicide care is forgiveness of the self than forgiveness of other. Suicide survivors often face a disrupted health that takes the shape of somatic complaints, headaches, and pains, and they need to control the kind of communication they have with insensitive people. Family members need a chance to be flexible, creating rituals of blessing, but also taking a break from typical traditions like holidays, if necessary. So, in the case where suicide impacts spouses, conjoint therapy is recommended for grieving it. So, therapy where people are counseled in their relationship. Children, Myers and Fine say that children should be told about a suicide, with words like kill and dead used. And then they should be helped to draw and express non-verbally their responses to the suicide. If possible, children should not be used as a primary emotional support for parents after a suicide. Many complicating factors such as postpartum depression, being a police officer, and military service can contribute to suicide risk. So the main idea of this book is that suicide survivors need support from other survivors as quickly as possible to destigmatize and give a sense of hope. And mental health professionals need to be comfortable discussing suicide, and ending therapy with a trusted counselor can be re-traumatizing. Counselors and ministers can be survivors of suicide as well. So faith after suicide is a deep grief in which God's heart breaks first. Some suicide survivors discover that they have to give up control in order to find God in the experience of suicide. Others don't find God at all, and they lose their faith as a result. The best ministers, I think, give the message that the loved one is not in hell, but that they've suffered enough. God understands hopeless situations, and it's faith organizations' jobs to communicate this consistently. So, suicide is rarely rational, always desperate act. So it's dying by suicide rather than committing suicide. Carla, one of the authors, found that her life was divided into before and after suicide. And it was a long time, but eventually she found that she was able to begin to remember her husband for how he lived, not just how he died. So forgiving the self is really the central role of suicide. Michael talks about losing a fellow medical student to suicide. So people who experience suicide experience something of being surreal, isolated, terrified, dazed, and heartbroken. The whys of their experience predominate early in the grieving process, and then they turn into what-ifs. There's often a question of how could I have not known the depth of his pain, and why did he choose to die alone? At the 3-year mark, all that Carla could think about was the suicide, the loss of her husband and partner. But she emphasizes that no matter how much you loved a person who committed suicide, you couldn't be their life support system. Often there's people discover that the internal world of the one that they loved who died by suicide is much more negative than they thought. There was a lot of negative grief, negative self-talk. And there's a sense in which you have to go through the desperation of suicide loss in order to get through it. So you can't sidetrack this grief process. The authors suggest that early on, especially suicide survivor groups are very important because they don't judge one another, and they tend to understand really difficult to comprehend experiences more quickly, leading people to feel less isolated. So the grieving process was a process of learning how she couldn't change the story that life had given her, but that she had to learn how to relate to the story and accept how she's changed. So suicide survivors are people whose stories have changed fundamentally. People who go through this experience often wonder if they're going crazy. There's a response of wanting to go to a psychic. there's really trauma symptoms, and it can be a relief to name these trauma symptoms of suicide survivors. The re-experiencing, the re-traumatizing, especially if you were the person who found the body. There's advice to let people help you, and reach out to folks even when this seems awkward. That was given by Emily Holmes. So early on, the process is about normalizing the loss and knowing you're not alone. They find that a trauma response can be born as long as there's a feeling of not being alone in that response. Anger really is a central experience of the suicide loss. There's anger at someone who seemed so gentle to the outside world but could do this. There's anger that the world goes on even though this particular person that you loved has died. Anger is a normal response after bad news. But it's helpful to remind suicide survivors that they will be able to experience some joy again. So anger, pure rage. Some people say that it's a protective emotion, that it protects people from feeling guilt. But nonetheless, it's a real emotion. So there's this question of denial and whether denial is ever okay after suicide, because grief is private. We might just wonder, what's the difference between dying from physical illness and dying from a mental illness? If it's easy to talk about cancer, why do we have such a hard time talking about a person's suicide? Part of it is a society where people don't want to be seen as disturbed in any way. Well, what's really important to emphasize is that it's your story to tell, and privacy is different from secrecy. Yet if you're ashamed of suicide, these authors suggest that you might be keeping a big secret. So sometimes there's people deny their grief response and just go right back to work and pretend like everything is okay. And often those things will end up coming back later. So it might be years after a suicide before people are willing to talk about it. But the big idea of the grief approach mentioned here is that talking about suicide makes you a pioneer in your own grieving, because so few people do it and so few people are willing to do it. That you being willing to talk about the grief related to suicide makes you a grief pioneer. So 6 months after the loss, many people will still face thoughts of avoidance and depression. A quarter to a half of grieving individuals will have PTSD, and in this case, it's important to seek out medical care. There's a difference between passive thoughts of suicide, where you just think about it, and then and kind of wish you were dead, versus active thoughts of suicide, where you have a plan and a time frame. Many people who go through this experience and become suicide survivors have passive thoughts of suicide, and that can be understood as a wish to be dead, to rejoin their loved ones, or be relieved from unbearable pain. There's often a feeling that you might not survive the death of your loved one. Grieve as long as you need to, and find ways to honor that grief and ritualize it. Wear black, do things that make you belong to this special club, which you really are a part of. One of the most important, so the Fine and Myers talk about a timeline. It's only in the second year that the reality of the loss hits you, and the second year is the hardest. The third year, the fog begins to lift, and the fifth year is a milestone of surviving and remaining almost intact. 7 years is biblical after the loss. Many people feel stigma after suicide, so it's important to be able to talk to someone about it and be able to talk somewhere. So people who are able to restore some sense of balance or learning to do things for themselves, The survivor, Carla, who's at the center of this book, says in her heart of hearts she's still not fully accepted Harry's decision to end his life. So even at the end of her grieving process, acceptance, incorporation of the loss might not be the ultimate goals here. In chapter 2, there's a discussion of searching for reasons. So we must look at the personal stories of the suicide survivors, not just the people who ended their lives and died by suicide, and not just the clinical histories of depression. So they say the canyon of why can be traversed with some support. So the canyon of why is when you ask the why questions. Why did this happen? And some support, therapeutic support, through these unanswered questions, along with some reassurance that it's not your fault, can really be helpful. You can tell a child your mother wasn't thinking of how her death would break your heart. The first thing you think is that this was preventable. But if you're unable to stop feeling overwhelmingly guilty for suicide, it's a good idea to talk with someone about it. So people with dual diagnosis who are diagnosed with addiction as well as mental illness are twice as likely to commit suicide. And people who are in the bipolar illness are more at risk during the depression phase versus the manic phase of the illness. And really, the book underscores the importance of therapy. Therapy is a place where you can come to believe that you can contend with this. So therapy is a place for people who've gone through this loss to begin to believe that they can contend with this. They put suicide within a broader context of different ways of dying, including alcoholism, and they talk about assisted suicide in some neutral ways. But they also talk about how firearms play a role in half of all youth suicide risks. And suicide is 5 times more likely in a house with a gun. So the goal of the therapy for those who face a suicide is insight, not forgiveness, for the person who committed suicide. So the goal of the therapy remains focused on the survivor themselves rather than on the person who died by suicide. So there's 15 to 20% of suicide loss that leaves a note, but these are difficult failures in communication. They can include apology and shame, love for those left behind, life being too much to bear, instructions on practical affairs, hopelessness, nothing to live for, and advice. They speak back to loved ones, but no one could write a meaningful note. And people who get a note are not able to reconcile any more easily. They actually reconcile without understanding. So part 2, what can I do? There's a discussion of protecting your health in chapter 3. There's a discussion of someone who discovers a body and then the kinds of trauma responses that they're going to have afterwards. And there's always the question of the intentionality of the act. And there's 2 parts to suicide grief, they say. First, you must go through the suicide, and then you can mourn the death. So grief for the death and the suicide itself seem fused, but when you look at the life cycle process of the grieving act itself, there's a going through the suicide, which involves all these steps, and then there's mourning the death, which can't happen until after the suicide itself is faced. So, and the goal for that therapy is incorporation, not relinquishment. So an old Kubler-Ross model would be that you accepted the death at the end, but that's not the goal here. The goal is actually to incorporate this death somehow into your life, not to let go of the person. So Chapter 4 talks about caring for your family, and how in suicide loss a meteorite crashes into your family, making everyone wonder, how did this become our lives? For each death by suicide, 7 people are directly or indirectly impacted, close or near. And the suicide loss then spirals out all different kinds of losses. The people who didn't get to know children or grandchildren and didn't get to live out those roles. Also, role loss for a spouse. They have a suggestion that you do whatever helps, that you don't confront someone who's not willing to face the loss. But there can be permanent changes in family structure as a result of this. Verbal outbursts, blaming, family coalitions where one person partners with another against the rest, alcohol abuse, cutoffs, scapegoating. That's where everybody agrees that one person in the family is the problem. The goal for a family is to try to develop open communication where you change traditions and you add healing rituals. And the marriage needs to be immersed in forgiveness from the start. The goal then is to provide some new framework or holding space for a family, and help them communicate with one another around this difficult loss rather than cutting each other off. Chapter 5 talks about telling your children. Children know about the mysteries, but they often feel left out by them. The words can seem mysterious, but by sharing, you're actually giving them a message that you love them, and that it's that you're not going to leave them, and it's normal for them to feel a lot of strong feelings. And those feelings are going to keep changing. So you want to tell them that you love them, tell them that you're not going to leave them, and that it's normal for them to have a lot of strong feelings. So if there was a lie told about the suicide, then it's important to apologize for lying and to tell the truth. Your best is good enough in caring for children. But the one warning of this book is be careful not to rely upon children as your primary support in the experience of suicide grief. If your children are afraid of suicide, then it's important also to talk about mental illness and some strategies for preventing and taking care of oneself. Chapter 6 talks about some specific circumstances around suicide that can be difficult, including multiple suicides, postpartum depression, murder/suicide, and police suicide, and then military suicide. So those are times when people, and then suicide by accident as well, where people get a motor vehicle involved or other things involved in that, and thus bring others into the suicide experience. So there's a range of groups that you can reach out to for support. Chapter 7 says immediate support groups as close to the death as possible are really helpful. And then for people, then there's also that need to kind of, in the 2-track model of bereavement, to also get help with the daily activities of daily living, the track 1 parts of bereavement. And it's people with friendships tend to do a little better in this realm. Chapter 8, getting help from mental health professionals. It's often not easy even to talk with mental health professionals about this topic, but you can't get over suicide without someone's help, and anger will often show up later if you don't get help from a therapist early on. How do you know if you're getting better? Well, ending therapy can sometimes, when you come to the end of doing therapy, can reawaken some of the wounds of the suicide itself. And the journey of therapy is really one of normalizing and destigmatizing these complicated feelings. Part 3 is about how I can go on finding meaning after suicide, and there's a whole chapter here for anybody interested in ministry on the spirituality after suicide, which is about honor and heartache. So some people do, after a suicide, find inner resources that come from their faith. One survivor said, "When my son died, God's heart was the first to be broken." Many survivors talk about how their faith has changed, though, and I can share with you a chapter about that in some of my previous work. So some people find that they have to give up control over things that they used to think they would be able to control, and find some way to embrace the mystery and the unknown. There's often a stigma from religion based on how religious people have treated suicide in the past. And the best ministers will say things like, "Your son has suffered enough," and that God understands hopeless situations. Ministers also can do a nice job when they talk about the person's life rather than just how they die. One risk is if you make suicide really bad from a theological standpoint, then you'll cause people to flee religion. So negative attitudes about suicide that don't understand the desperation of people's situations can then cause people to run away from religion and cause religious trauma. So losing meaning, chapter 10 talks about life-preserving insights into suicide and suicide attempts. And they talk about how losing meaning is different from losing hope. One person says after 16 years, she still misses her husband, but it was her husband's decision. Loss is one of the biggest determinants that go into a suicide. And people are faced with an ambivalent feeling afterwards. There's a discussion of physician-assisted suicide and how people come to the decision to make euthanasia in the middle of really difficult suffering. So organizations for people who have attempted suicide seem to suggest that the risk is higher in the first and second years after an attempt. So for people who are in this situation of risk, it's important to do more listening than talking. Keep judgments to yourself in the immediate aftermath. So suicide attempts are often a symptom of an underlying problem. And the need for a suicide hotline center and a call center, and making a no suicide contract. One of the most important parts of this book, I think, is, and it's just all the way through this approach by people who understand it personally, is the need to erase stigma for suicide. There's no owner's manual for the death of a child, but the really important thing is to bring this subject out of the closet. This is a pressing public health concern. The rates of suicide in the last few years have just really risen. But the stigma is experienced by grievers as being like a chokehold that grips people by the throat and weakens their voices. So suicide is a public health problem. Here's a really key point. No suicide survivors have to become activists with their grief. They could just grieve silently and never speak up about their experience in a public way. But you can, and you can talk about you can make your grief very public and talk about public platforms for suicide prevention and that kind of thing. But nobody has to. And keeping the suicide private is a perfectly fine way of grieving. It doesn't interfere with the grieving process. As long as you have somebody to walk through this journey with you, you don't have to make your grief public. Carla found that the stigma of suicide is often deep within the self. And so she found that it was really important for her and for her co-author, Michael Myers, to write this book together. The book essentially becomes a transitional object for the two of them, in that it helps them move from a stage where they were experiencing a lot of loss to a new stage where they were able to make, if not meaning out of the loss, they were able to gain insight into the loss. And what we have in this book is really a tremendous gift to pastoral caregivers who, regardless of whether they've gone through this journey themselves or with someone in their congregation, and I hope that hasn't been the case for you, But if it has, it can be a moment of self-forgiveness and self-insight. You are a suicide survivor if that's your situation. It can also be a tremendous gift to pastors in terms of getting started, understanding a very complicated experience, but a very common experience in your congregation and in the lives of people in your care. So my recommendation is to take this book, Touched by Suicide, seriously and spend a lot of time with it, and then make it one of the something you return to again and again in your ministry of loss and grief, particularly for the hope it provides and for the kind wisdom that's interspersed on every page. Thanks very much for listening to this video.